seniors, welcome to my economics class. Today we're going to review some concepts related to the cross-elasticity of demand. Okay, the links that we have to focus on from previous chapters that we took in quarter 2 was related to the non-price determinants of demand. One of them, which was the demand for the substitute goods and the demand for the complementary goods, which is called the joint demand. All right, let's move on. All right, so let's recall the difference between the substitute goods and the complementary goods. First of all, let's just go through again the definition for the substitute good. All right, so we know that the substitute good is a good that can be used in place of another good. In consumer theory, the substitute goods or substitutes are products that consumers perceive as similar or comparable. So either the consumer choose A or choose product B. So an example of this would be the tea versus the coffee. So you're going to end up drinking tea or coffee. Another close substitute is the cinema or just watching Netflix, right? Pepsi versus Coca-Cola, also these products are substitute goods. Or Sony PlayStation and Microsoft Box, you're going to choose only one of them in order to enjoy your time playing video games. Another example of the substitute goods, which is the Uber versus the taxi. At the end of the day, you're going to choose when you go to the cinema or when you go to the shopping mall, then you have to decide whether you're going to take an Uber or a taxi. So all these examples are examples of substitute goods. You're going to end up choosing product A, which is the tea, or product B, which is the coffee, but you're not going to buy both of them, right? Okay. So the complementary good, on the other hand, is are the goods which are used together in order to satisfy the same need. An example for this is the PlayStation console, the device itself, and the PlayStation controller that you're using in order to manipulate or to control the game, right? Printer and ink, both of them complement each other. Therefore, the demand for printer and ink, or the demand for the PlayStation console and the PlayStation controller, is called joint demand. Another example, another famous example would be the fuel and the car. When you're buying a car, you have to fill it up with fuel. So fuel and cars, this is complementary good. Printer and ink, this is another example of complementary good. And PlayStation console and the PlayStation controller is yet another example of complementary goods. Okay, so now after we know the difference between the complementary good and the substitute good, we have to know what do we mean by the cross-elasticity of demand. So cross-elasticity of demand is the responsiveness. This is the magical word in the definition for any type of elasticity. So the word is responsiveness of quantity demanded for a product due to change in the price of its complementary or substitute product. Okay, so from calculating the cross-elasticity of demand that we're talking here about, we want to know if the price of the ink cartridges for Samsung printers increased, how will this affect the quantity demanded on the printers of Samsung? So again, we're not looking at the effect of the increase in the price for a product like the ink cartridge on the demand for the ink cartridge, but we are looking at the effect of increasing the price of the ink cartridge on the demand for the printers, which is called a complementary good. So an example of this is we wanted to know the responsiveness of change in the demand for Netflix memberships after the increase in the price of the cinema tickets. So product number one, which is the Netflix memberships, and the increase in the price in the cinema tickets. Now, what's the relationship between the two, which is Netflix and cinema tickets? All right, yeah, that's right, because the cinema tickets and the Netflix memberships, these are substitutes, or this is an example of substitute products. All right, let's move on. Okay, so this is the formula for calculating the cross elasticity of demand, which is the percentage of change in the quantity demanded of product X divided by the percentage of change in price of product Y, right? Okay, let's move on. Now, using the previous formula, we would have a number of possibilities for the XED coefficient, either to have the XED more than the 1, in this case, then the demand is said to be cross-price elastic, which means that a small change, a very tiny change in the price of a product results in the effect of this is going to be a bigger change in the quantity demanded for the other product. Possibility number 2, which is that the XED is less than the 1. This means that the demand is called cross-price inelastic, which means that a change in the price of a product results in smaller change in the demand for the other. Okay, or we would have XED is 0. This happens only in the case of unrelated products. Unrelated products, an example of this is the book of matches and houses. They are not substitute products, they are not complementary products, and therefore the XED for this type of products is 0. All right. Now let's take a scenario. Let's think about the XED coefficient, whether it's negative or positive. Now, the XED coefficient, the positive and the negative, it tells us about whether we're talking about the demand for substitute goods or complementary goods, right? Okay, so let's see. Okay, let's talk about the scenario where the prices of the cinema tickets has just increased, right? What would be the substitute of a cinema, of going to the cinema? All right, yeah, that's right, because, you know, the Netflix would be a close substitute for the cinema tickets, right? Okay, so the first effect, or the short time effect, or the short run effect, would be a fall in the demand for the tickets, assuming that all other factors remain constant. So when the price of the cinema tickets increase, this will lead, again, assuming all other factors remain constant, this will lead to an increase in the demand for the substitute of the cinema, which is the Netflix, definitely. Now, let's assume, or let's go back again to the formula of the XED, an increase in the price cinema tickets. This means that we have changed or a positive change in the price of the tickets. This leads to an increase in the demand for Netflix, so increase and increase, which means that we have positive and positive change. Again, considering the XED formula, positive over positive is also positive. So the moral of the story here in this slide is that the coefficient for the XED for the substitute goods is always positive. Why? Because both the numerator will be positive and the denominator will be positive, or negative over negative, which is also positive. So again, to recap on this concept, to recap on the sign of the XED coefficient, the XED coefficient for substitute goods is always positive. This is one of the questions that you might have in your exam, which is related to the positive or negative XED coefficient and the difference between the positive and the negative XED coefficient. All right. Now let's move on to the negative XED coefficient. What does it mean? Well, I do not want you to memorize, but I want you always to think about the logic, right? Okay. Now let's think about the XED for the complementary good. All right. In order to simplify it, in order to make it much easier, we have to think about a scenario and a real life example on what could be considered as complementary good. All right. So let's think about the printer, right? The printer, and also the ink cartridges which is used in the printers. Okay. Let's assume that in the real life example here, that the price of the printers increased. How will this affect the demand for the ink cartridge, which is the complementary good for the printers? Okay, so let's go step by step. Number one, what is going to change here is the price of the printer. This will lead to a fall in the demand, or this would lead to a fall in the demand for the printers, right? Assuming that all other factors remain constant. All right. Now, the fall in the demand for the printers will lead, in the short run or in the long run, this will lead to a possible fall in the demand for ink cartridge. So let's look at the orange box here and the blue box here. What happened first is that there was an increase in the price of printers. This leads to a fall in the demand. So this is positive change and this is negative change, which means that at the end, the XED coefficient will be negative. Why? Again, considering the XED formula, increase in the price of the printer, this is a positive change in the price of the printer, divided by fall in the demand for ink, which means negative sign or negative change in the demand for the printers. At the end, the XED equals positive over negative. This is going to be negative. So the summary for this is that yes, the XED for the complementary good will be always negative, right? Okay. Now let's think about this scenario. The scenario here is talking about the possible effects and the change or possible effects of the increase in the price of the taxi tariffs, right, on the demand for the Uber trips. Before answering this question, we would think about the relationship between the two products here, taxi and Uber, right? Are they complementary goods or substitute goods? Okay, so you're going to end up either choosing a taxi or an Uber, and therefore, yes, and therefore, if the taxi tariffs increased, this would actually encourage the people to order Uber instead. So an increase in the price of the taxi tariffs, this is a positive change because we're talking about increase. This would lead to an increase in the demand for the Uber trips. The number of the journeys or the number of the orders for Uber cars is going to increase because people will use the cheaper substitute So this is positive over positive is going to be positive, right? Okay, so another scenario. Let's have a look at the possible effect of the increase in the price of PlayStation consoles on the PlayStation controllers. Again, let's recall the main assumption for the analysis here, which is the ceteris paribus. So the ceteris paribus, we assume that all other factors remain constant. Okay, so let's think about the relationship between the PlayStation consoles and the PlayStation controllers. Are they substitute or complementary? Yes. Alright, so when you buy a PlayStation console, this device, you have to buy a controller with it in order to be able to play, right? Okay, so when the price of the PlayStation console increases, this would lead to a fall in the demand for the PlayStation devices, right? And therefore, when people buy less consoles, it means that people will also buy less what? Buy less PlayStation controllers, right? Okay, so an increase in the price of the PlayStation would lead to a fall in the demand for the PlayStation controllers. This is positive change over negative change, or negative over positive. This means that we're going to have a negative with negative XED coefficient. All right?